Hi, my name is Janice McWhertor, and I'm going to be your teaching leader for this week. We're on Lesson 7, and the title is Getting Perspective, which I think all of us can appreciate. I'd like to start by reading the passage. So it's James 4, 11 through 17. First is warning against judging another. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. So who then are you to judge your neighbor? Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a town and spend a year there doing business and making money. Yet you do not even know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wishes, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it commits sin. This is the word of the Lord. Getting perspective. In this lesson, number 7, James returns to one of his favorite themes, the destructive power of the tongue. And if you remember, 2 weeks back in James 3, my conversation with you was about the deadly poison of the tongue. And here in chapter 4, verse 11, he urges, do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Here he speaks in a little bit more of an intimate tone by using brothers and sisters. And maybe there's not quite as an intense urgency, but James is still urgent. Martha Moore Keish reminds us that James leans heavily on Leviticus and assumes that his audience knows Leviticus. Leviticus 19:16 is a verse that you can tell complements the verse in James. 19:16 of Leviticus goes, you shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You can see the connection. Today, James helps us think about slander, or as the NRSV says, speaking evil, and judging. If we slander and judge, we place ourselves above the law. And by doing this, we place ourselves above God, which then we recognize is a clear idolatry. James says to us, do not judge, because to judge another person is to usurp the place of God. And no one but God has the right to act as a supreme judge of another. Now, I am certain everyone who is watching this video knows this about speaking evil or slander and judging. We might wish by this point in our lives that our tendency to judge has faded, or our inclination towards slander is no longer a problem. However, I think we all know that is not true. Slandering and judging are still common sins that we commit, even if we only do it silently. So for today, I invite us to look at judging and slander, or speaking evil, from both a societal view and from an individual view. My readings helped me do this, and so I want to pass this along to you. Every society needs people who judge when genuine wrongdoing occurs, and to decide how justice is to be restored. So parents, teachers, police, courts, judges, neighbors, I think that then takes in all of us. We need to exercise some kind of judgment regularly. Every society needs civil authorities to keep citizens safe. Every family needs mature adults to guide children. So James urges us to remember a very foundational point here as we are involved in judging or slandering. God alone is the final judge and the final one and only lawgiver. No matter what our role or vocation, all of us will be called upon to make judgments. And James reminds us that we must judge responsibly, very conscious of the possibility of making mistakes. Well, this reminds me immediately of chapter 3, when James singled out teachers and said that they were going to be held to a stricter standard, and even with that, they were still going to make mistakes. So similarly, I think James makes it clear here that we as Christians will be held to a strict standard when it comes to judgment. And we will never be able to do it perfectly. So this week, COS is offering the first of 2 conversations about a movie and book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Sunday nights, November 8 and 15 at 6:30. And it's going to be on Zoom, of course. So I encourage us all to register for this. I think it's going to be a good, necessary conversation. I think this passage in James can have a direct application when we think about judgment and incarceration. When we apply this idea that God alone is the lawgiver and judge, this truth carries with it an important call to humanity for any of us that work in law enforcement, sit in a courtroom as a jury or as a judge. Again, that takes in all of us at some point in our lives, declaring innocence or guilt on accused people. Brian Stevenson is one of those leaders who has brought our attention to the plight of people who have been wrongly convicted. James challenges us when he says in verse 12, "Who are you to judge your neighbor?" A question like that automatically humbles us and makes us pull back, I think. And there is evidence, and Brian Stevenson brings that out, that as a society, we have used prejudice, judgment without justice, leadership without proper accountability, arrogance, slander, evil talk, all of which has led to erroneously convicting innocent people. And not just a few. It is, I think, a contemporary example of verse 11. Speaking evil against another, speaking evil against the law. When we are called upon to judge, says James, we are to be doers of God's law. God's judgment will always establish true justice, not false accusations that result in unjust convictions, and then unjust incarceration. Gives us something to think about. Looking at it from another angle, and still working with this theme of judgment and incarceration, when someone is convicted fairly, when, as they say, the conviction fits the crime, James' warning about judgment invites us to consider what true human justice looks like. Does it still look like speaking evil? Is the sentence that was handed out dehumanizing for those who are convicted? Could the justice system seek the restoration of the person, even a person who may have caused great harm to their neighbor? Could the ones who harmed others have the opportunity to repent and work to repair the harm done to victims and their families? Could the convicted be restored instead of only punished? With the present day movement of restorative justice, there are many who seem to be working out what James is talking to us about here. The royal law, as James calls it in chapter 2, verse 8, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Restorative justice might be an example of this. Let's also think outside of the courts. How can all of us be doers of God's love and mercy in society? Can we have a constant, a steady desire to restore one another to wholeness, just like the Lord does for us? I think it's true. When we embrace the royal law, when we embrace loving our neighbor as ourself, we see fruits. We see fruits in ourselves. We will see fruits in our church and in our society. James gives us some good things to think about here, some practical things. Now, the second part of our passage is verses 13 through 17. At first, I didn't think they were connected, but I realized that with James saying, "Come now," he shows us that this next part is an outgrowth of the one that was just previous. And here James helps us think about how to approach tomorrow. Now, I say the word tomorrow with some nervousness because today is election day, and how to think about tomorrow or the next tomorrow is very much on my mind. Remember, the title of this lesson is Getting Perspective. So James has us examine slightly more subtle forms of speaking evil, that of boasting. And arrogance occurs when we assume that we control time and that we control events. In these verses, James targets wealthy merchants who travel and make money for their own benefit, seemingly with not much thought for others, or without thoughts about their own mortality, their own limitations. So it's not clear here if James is only talking to the Jewish Christian community. It may be that actions of the broader community are causing pain for the Jewish Christian community. But even without being real clear about that, we are clear that this issue of merchant money-making is causing trouble. So, thinking about old days, the commercial travel in Palestine had become easier under Roman rule. Because of the expansion of the empire, there was also more protection for the merchants, and there were good roads. There were even paved roads. So I wonder what James might like to say to us today as we extend our commerce worldwide through the internet. I think he could still ask us, whose business are we doing? How much is God considered in our planning? Are we aware that we are as stable as a mist, appearing for a little while and then vanishing? I think during this time of COVID, many business owners have realized that vanishing mist describes their situation. It's not trading and doing business that James is against. James is concerned that the merchant's only focus is making money. The problem is a focus on personal gain rather than on, here we are again, God's royal law, which requires mercy toward others. Always, James pushes us to think communally. Personal attitudes, personal actions, and how they affect the community. We are like a vanishing mist unless God establishes us. We are completely dependent on God. There is really no such thing as self-sufficiency, right? Even if the wealthy merchants seem to boast about it. So living out the royal law, as James refers to it, again, and think about James 2:8, which is seeking to love our neighbor. This is a lifelong practice, isn't it? James calls us to endurance, long-term investment in doing good, in everything. In this case, he's talking about speaking, judging, and doing business. I remember when I was working here at Church of the Servant as the minister of congregational life, and we would have discussions on how lost we would sometimes get in our plan making. Sometimes we got so busy, we lost sight that God needed to be the director of our plans, the reason for any planning at all. And we decided that the phrase, God willing, or inshallah, in verse 15, that the Muslims and Arab Christians often use, could be instructive for us too. Sometimes we needed to be reminded that we did not control the future. Sometimes we needed to be reminded that all plans are placed within the mysterious context, a bigger context of God's plan of mercy. So when we say, if God wills, or God willing, we remind ourselves that we do not control the future. Then we gain a perspective, and then we can consider what the Lord wishes for us. Then we can make a plan, and then be doers of the word. Open our eyes, O Lord, that we may see wondrous things out of your law. That's Psalm 119, verse 18. Open our eyes, O Lord, that we may see wondrous things out of your law. Pastor Karen helped me think about this in her sermon on Habakkuk. The situation was very different, but the people there could only see their immediate situation, and they felt great sorrow that God was not rescuing them. And God opened Habakkuk's eyes to more sorrow, but a bigger picture of what God was doing. Karen said, "The Lord, through Habakkuk, helps us to widen our gaze." And I think that's also what James is trying to do for us here. I love the Lord's Prayer. It helps me widen my gaze. In it we say, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Finally, James ends this passage in verse 17 with the sentence, "Anyone then who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it commits sin." We are called to be a friend of God, not a friend of the world. Pay attention to God's law, says James, and just do it. I take this to heart as I prepare myself for the outcome of this election. So once again, James gets our attention with curtness or maybe urgency. And once again, the answer is the same. He confronts sinful motives, evil practices, and he is also equally clear for us about the promise of God's grace. James helps us get perspective. So, since I was thinking about the Lord's Prayer as I was preparing this, I'm wondering if I could just close by praying this. Our Father, who is in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, for yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.